I'm Reeves Kurtner, and this is In Your Business. Season 1 of In Your Business is presented by Moses Auto Mall of Huntington, online at mosesmeansmore.com, and powered by the Huntington Regional Chamber of Commerce and Kindred Communications. This week, we're joined by Dr. Alan Letton, Director of the Center for Economic and Community Development in Black Appalachia and Isolated Communities. We're going to explore a topic that's not just crucial for businesses, but is a cornerstone for building vibrant and sustainable communities: diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI. We discuss the importance of DEI, the challenges, and more. Let's get in your business. Well, let's start, if you can, tell us about your background first.
So, I like to describe myself as a super nerd. So I started off wanting to be a scientist. I had the fortune. So there's a well-known scientist in U.S. history, Dr. Percy Julian, one of the first black scientists, ended up starting his own pharmaceutical company. And he kind of mentored my father and convinced us that we needed to go into science. So my father was a PhD chemist, was a senior chemist at Procter & Gamble. And so I always thought that's where I would be, as kind of a super scientist kind of guy. I had this love for jazz and music as well, so I actually got an offer to go play professionally at a high school, and then my father said, "Well, I will disown you if you do that. You need to go into school." So I went to MIT, chemical engineering and chemistry, did my PhDs, chemistry and polymer science. Chemical engineering and polymer science at the University of Cincinnati, and so I went the route of I went to Dow Chemical, became the research leader for Central Labs out of Texas. From there, I went to Texas A&M. Decided to go the academic route, spend time there, and got tenured, and did all the super nerd stuff. Traveled the world, presenting papers and all that. And then while I was there, I ended up getting more and more into the professional development in the African American community and trying to understand our role in business. That led me to end up going to Alabama, where I became the Dean of Engineering and Architecture. So I was a dean at the age of 34.
Wow.
So I got exposed to a lot of corporate partnerships there, worked very closely with Ford and a number of other organizations. And again, I start to see some of the challenges of inclusivity in corporate America, both from my own experience and from that experience as well. From there, end up getting recruited into Allied Signal, which is now Honeywell, and to run their central laboratories. And so again, this integration of science and business, and I ended up moving more and more to that balance. So after Allied Signal, went to Avon Products, where I made the world beautiful, is what I tell people. So I was director of new technologies at Avon. That got me into the biotech world, and so I ended up going and becoming the chief science officer and president for a company called Polymerics, which was a medical device company. And we ended up licensing that technology. During the end of that company, I was asked to come to North Carolina to Sealy, where I became then Chief Science Officer and Senior Vice President of Research, Engineering, and Quality worldwide for Sealy. So I spent time there. Sealy was eventually bought by Tempur-Pedic, and then I went from there, and that's when I ended up coming here to Huntington.
I was going to ask, how do we get to Huntington?
So I have Rubberlight brought them here into Sealy to do some work for us, and we did some materials development. When I left, the board asked me to come in and join, so I came to Rubberlight as the president, chief science officer, and then once I was here, I started getting involved with Marshall, a lot of community development work, which I still do, economic development, and that's how I got here.
How long have you been in Huntington now?
Almost about 15 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and there's a lot to kind of go over, but you kind of hinted at this a few times, but talk about what throughout your career, what motivated you to focus on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion in your career? What were some of those things that you saw in your career that made you want to make this kind of your mission?
Yeah, I have to laugh because what motivated me was being African American. I had the fortune, but the challenge of being the first in many areas.
Okay.
Being the first in the C-suite. At Texas A&M, I was the first African American that was tenured. We had over 800 engineering faculty at Texas A&M. I was the first African American tenured in that history.
Wow.
I started a number of organizations, National Society of Black Engineers. I started the professional end of that because all through my career and all while I was at Texas A&M, I realized the unique challenges of being a person of color trying to navigate the corporate world. And it became a passion of mine because I didn't want people to have to suffer and the way that I did as I matriculated through my career. So that's really what became the motivation, is how do we do this in a way that helps people so that everybody doesn't have to struggle the way I do.
Can you talk about some of those unique challenges?
Sure, yeah. There's a variety of them. I laugh about something. When I got to Dow, for example, I was put into their accelerated mentoring program. But on the soft side of things, everybody at Dow, if you were going to become a senior manager at Dow, you have to spend time in what we call Dow Mecca, which is Midland, Michigan. But you go to Midland, Michigan, there was no cultural support. You couldn't even get a haircut. You're looking at me now, I have no, I shave my head now, still have hair. But, if you can't even get a haircut, you can't even go and relax in a community, that becomes a challenge.
Sure.
And at the same time, I had an event that happened while I was there where someone senior in the organization drew a Ku Klux Klan and a burning cross on my whiteboard in my office and says, "We're coming for you," because they said you're becoming too successful too quickly. So, those are very direct, kind of incidences. When I was at Texas A&M, I never forget, I had just gotten a research grant that allowed me to move in to the top floor of a research building. And so I had my whole research group there. And one night the police walk in and they said, we'd like to question you. I said, why? And they said, well, there's rumor that there was a strange black guy walking around on campus. I said, well, you could say I'm strange,
right.
But,
Sure.
This is my office, this is where I work. So you start to get both these direct and indirect kind of moments of aggression, and you hear people question whether you qualify for promotions. So it's just all through my career
Sure.
I ran into those kind of things.
So you mentioned you came to Huntington for Rubber Light, and then you started doing more and more at Marshall University. Talk about the creation of the Center for Economic and Community Development in Black Appalachia and isolated communities. You've kind of hit on why you saw the need for it, but talk about how that was created.
So that was created because as I did got into more and more community work here in Huntington, I realized that a lot of people were coming up with ideas and, they're throwing spaghetti at the wall and they wanted to see what worked. They weren't doing the more disciplined approach. And this is where that research background comes in. How do we needed an organization that would sit down and figure out what are the possible solutions, analyze them to see which ones will work, and then implement them. If you think about the success of things like the Me Too movement, for example, one of the great things about that movement is you had people who were very disciplined. We created centers of excellence at different nonprofits, universities. They came up with solutions that work. A very tangible outcome, for example, is that they came up with language to put into the entertainment community's contracts that now is standard for women when they go through it. No one has ever done that historically in the African American community when it comes to economic community development. So we started talking, Sean Hornbuckle and I started talking with Jim Justice about 3 years ago, and we've been having this dialogue to try to get him and other legislators to understand. Eventually, he came to the point. He says, "I get it. We really do need to do something." And so, March at the State of the State address, he announced that he was going to make that investment to start the center.
This past March 2023.
Correct.
So what is the mission of the Economic and Community Development in Black Appalachian Isolated Communities. Long name there.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
But what is the mission? What's the goal? Where do we want to be in 5 years, 10 years?
Good question. So the mission is, if you look at economic and community development throughout the country, and if you look at population densities, so counties that have population densities of 50,000 and less, you'll see that there is no successful unifying model of economic community development. And that's both growing businesses. It's been hit and miss. So the first mission is to go out in a very systematic way and understand why that hasn't been successful, why that effort hasn't been successful, and how do we make it successful. For example, there's a model, economic model of Charles Morone, who looks at, he was the one that developed the Asheville, North Carolina downtown. He's got a particular way that he analyzes to figure out what are the right leverages that you use to do economic development. We want to go and try some of those and analyze some communities here and look. So the mission is to take those tool sets and to understand Black Appalachia. And isolated community means former coal community. So, we want to have a living experimental community. So we're using Fairfield and Huntington as one, and we're looking at Logan County as the second one. And so that's the mission, is go out and figure out how to do that. The second one is to create a knowledge or center of excellence in understanding these communities from an economic community perspective. There's a lot of research out there that can tell you what the average salary is, what the poverty rate is. That's great, but where's the research to tell you how to get out of that?
Sure.
And that's what we're talking about. That's the second mission.
You mentioned Asheville. So are we kind of basing this program off of what Asheville has done? And the reason I bring it up is when I talk to, I love Huntington. And I love some of the things that have been happening over the last 5, 10, 15 years. I mean, I graduated from Marshall in 2004, and just to see what has changed in Huntington, I think it's been great. And there's so many good stories. Mm-hmm. I tell people all the time, I think we could be like an Asheville. I love Asheville, North Carolina, but when I go there, it really reminds me of Huntington and Charleston. It's got a town, it's got a downtown, but it's got all these great restaurants and breweries and distilleries and mountains. I'm like, this is us. So anyway, I talk about Asheville all the time, and I think that we could be a city like that.
No, you're absolutely right. And to get into the weeds a bit,
yeah, sure.
Here's what you've got to start doing. And as a matter of fact, I just had a lunch conversation about this. First, you have to look at what are the structural things that need to be fixed. For example, if you look at the Fairfield community, it does not sit in an opportunity zone. As a matter of fact, in the majority of the Appalachia, opportunity zones stop at Black communities. So you got to ask yourself, what kind of zoning do we set up? One of the things that's happened in Asheville, and I do think that's a very good model, is they went to a mixed-use zoning, which gives you access to new market tax credits and some other financial tools that we can't access yet in these communities we want to develop. So when you look at that Asheville model, yeah, we could do that. We got to fix the zoning. How do we get access to new market tax credits and some of these other tools? And then how do you bring resources within the community together to grow? An example being, I've been meeting in Fairfield with individual businesses, and I'm finding out there's ecosystems that you create. One around women's health and beauty, for example, another around culinary. And then when you do a deeper dive, you figure out what are the shared resources that we can pull together. Now we're doing job creation. Now we're stabilizing businesses. That's bringing tax revenue into the economy. And that model in Asheville was to figure out how to capture all of that in a very condensed way so that we don't have to go and build a new infrastructure somewhere else.
That's right.
You take what you have here and build it. That's the key to Asheville. They took the resources that were there, particularly those of downtown, converted them to mixed use in a very structured way, nurtured those organizations, those restaurants. And, it's a great example. I love going there. And their culinary scene is incredible.
Sure.
Because of that. But that's the way that you have to do this. And I do believe you can do that here in Huntington.
I might edit this next part out because I might be going into the weeds. Do you know Rashad Sanders?
I do, yes.
I only know Rashad. I know Rashad through Marshall Alumni Association. We're on the board together, and he does some work with us, like DJing and events and things like that. Help me, doesn't he work for like the Fairfield Development?
So Rashad is executive director for Fairfield.
We've never talked about like our personal businesses and lives and that kind of stuff. So I'm like, is Rashad involved in this? You know?
So yes, he is. So he is the executive director for the Fairfield Community Development Corporation.
Okay.
Which is a new concept here. So let me step back and talk about CDCs, and then we talk about what Rashad's role can be in this community development effort. So CDCs were developed around the Kennedy administration, and the purpose of those are to find a particular need in a community, and under a specific tax structure be able to facilitate the solution for that need. Back when they were first started, there was probably about 250, 300 of them throughout the country, and they were focused on community development, specifically affordable housing. They were specifically focused on economic and business development. And then there were some others that were very specific. For instance, Philadelphia has a women's focused CDC that looks for support for single mothers, for example. So the CDC here in Fairfield was developed, I guess now about 5 years ago. I was on the original board that helped select Rashad. So Rashad has a unique opportunity to really take the CDC, get it focused on some specific agendas, and then use the power of tax opportunities, being able to get grants, and to focus his resources on solving those problems.
Got it.
I don't want to speak for Rashad on what those are, but that's the whole purpose of the CDC. And Rashad will be working closely with us as we do this.
Sure. So let's talk about, this got announced in March at the State of the State earlier this year. How has the support been from the state so far, City of Huntington so far, Marshall University so far?
So, although the funding was awarded on I think it was the 13th of March, if I remember the date, the center got set up in the middle of May.
Okay.
So we've started in the middle of May. Support in Marshall's been great. Brad Smith took me through a rigorous review to make sure I was the right person to bring in, which was the right thing to do, and to make sure the center was focused. It has now been aligned with under Tony Strad, where it's part of the Economic Workforce Development Group. So Brandon Dennison is that part of that group. So that is the right place for it. So it's got the right resources to move forward, and we're starting to identify opportunities just by talking together.
That's right.
That we can partner with. So it's been good reception there. The Huntington community, so the center was started with $1 million. The target is to raise another $4 million over the next 2 years. So the idea is that money will seed programs, research, and we'll leverage that. We'll continue to write grants and everything else. We have had an excellent response from the Huntington business community. We probably have a commitment of over $500,000 already. We're going to start soliciting with larger corporations, but the response has been good. The response has been very good in the community. So I've been going out and starting to do some of that basic research, interacting with everyone. We're going to have an official opening of the center here in a couple of months, so you'll hear about it.
Perfect.
So that we can introduce it formally to the community and its purpose. So far, the reception has been very good. I would say it's actually been better than that. I think we're all seeing the need. Just having the right resources talking to each other.
That's right.
Has been a tremendous impact so far.
Today we want to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. First of all, if you can't give us an overview of what that is and why it's important to the business world.
Right. So as a matter of fact, I was just reading a paper at Harvard Business Review that's kind of looking at where is DEI going in current times. And so the research part of this that says why is it important, it's pretty straightforward now. It's pretty standardized, been proven over and over. If you look at our population and you look at non-white males, right? So if you start looking at women, people of color, neurodiverse, LGBTQ, you just look at that, you're talking about almost 40 to 50% of the population is represented in that group. From a business perspective, why do you want to not sell to half the population, not hire half the population, and not obtain leadership, from half the population? It's a pretty straightforward argument.
That's right.
So that's the first part of it. But why it's important to focus specifically on it are the challenges of making inclusion normal within an organization's practice. If you think about it, I said, I give you the over numbers, but if you look at the African American community versus the Latin community versus LGBT communities, each one of those has a different path to how they got here. So the challenges within the African American community coming from a history of slavery and segregation are very different than an immigrant population coming in.
That's right.
And so it becomes very important to understand those differences and to design programs so that you can go after that other 40 or 50% of the population.
Talk about that same question, but in context to Huntington and Appalachia. I don't know the numbers, but I would assume that it's less than 40 to 50% in our area.
Collectively, it's not that much different.
Okay.
So if we talk specifically, so the African-American community only makes up about 6% of West Virginia.
Okay.
Appalachia in general, the numbers fluctuate because when you start looking at Tennessee and North Carolina, you may be higher.
That's right.
So you may be, the numbers I'm seeing somewhere around 8 or 9%. So again, it's still a significant part.
Sure.
The Huntington community is the second largest African American population next to Charleston. So Charleston, Huntington, Morgantown, Beckley, and Parkersburg make up the greatest percentage of African American populations here. So yes, it is very important for us in Huntington because of that. When you start looking at women, when you start looking at the LGBTQ population, you're still going to be up where around, if I remember the numbers, 25 to 30% total population. So although on the surface, because I think we tend to think DEI only focuses on the African American population, truth is it is much broader than that, and so you're still talking about significant numbers.
That's right. And let me ask you this too. I mean, I think one of our biggest challenge, and does this? I guess I'm asking, does this relate to what I'm about to say? I think one of our biggest challenges in West Virginia is population. Right? I mean, we're the only state that has less people in it today than we did in 1950. And I don't care what color you are, what religion you are, whatever. We need people. Does this go in line with that we want to be inviting to African Americans, to Latinos, LGBT, right? I mean, West Virginia, we need people. We really, really do. We just lost our third person in the House of Representatives. So does this have something to do with that as well? Is that a part of the goal as well, to be more welcoming, opening?
That's a great point. And yes, that's absolutely it. We're trying to bring in more and more companies, even if we talk about remote operations, that are addressing that broad distribution of people, right? That when they're looking at consumers across the spectrum. So we're going to have people here who represent that. So absolutely, you cannot just bring in one group of people here and have them working for a company that serves the world. You just can't do it.
Right.
So, and yes, we need to get our population up for all the right reasons, right? But yeah, so we need to be very welcoming to a diverse group of people. And what makes up that group in terms of how do we attract them is probably not what we think it is. I look at my son who lives in Seattle, Washington. He works for Amazon Web Services on hardware design part of it. He loves to canoe. He hiked Kilimanjaro. He's not your typical guy from the 60s that I came from. So it actually may be a little bit easier because this generation that we're trying to recruit, they're more sensitive to outdoors, they're more sensitive to the environment, and that's where we are. So yes, it is an issue we have to address, but it's probably easier for us than we think.
We talk about some of the challenges that businesses in this area face when it comes to DEI.
So the challenge is that there's several fold. So the first one is we've got to figure out what does that mean in terms of what are the targets. One of the areas I'm very committed to is how do you incorporate DEI into strategy in a meaningful way. Just going after doing bias training is not the solution to DEI. So that means you got to treat it like any other business outcome. And what are the KPIs? What are the objectives? So when you start doing that, you sit here in Huntington and say, okay, if our feeder population of employees, for example, is 6%, then I need to be figuring out how do I get that 6% to come into to my organization. So for Huntington, we have to think about what are the right performance metrics for DEI. What does that look like? What is the talent we need to bring in? And what does it look like in that talent pool? I always give the example, if we're trying to find chemical engineers to come here, which we have companies like Nucor and everyone who needs chemical engineers, the African-American chemical engineering population is only about 2%. So we got to be realistic and say, our target is to bring in 2%. Whereas if we're looking for folks who are doing coding and everything else, that's a much higher number. And that's a population, because it's remote work, that's very well suited here.
That's right.
So it's very important for us to grow, but the DEI part of it, it's really about how do you set your strategy to go after the right people and the right numbers to get everybody here.
So what are the keys to implementing a successful strategy?
So the first key is to analyze where you are.
Okay.
So you got to understand where you are, both in terms of the organization and in terms of the recruiting community, not the current community, but the recruiting community. The second thing is, and this was in this Harvard Business Review article I was just reading, you've got to look beyond just the numbers. There's plenty of research out there that says, DEI is about profit. We know that teams are more effective. You get more innovation. You have a greater consumer base if you incorporate DEI. That's well known. We don't need to debate that. But that's really about the business analytics part. The second one is you have to challenge yourself and ask, what is the moral obligation we have for DEI? If we're a democratic society, then we're doing this because it's part of who we are as an American people. And once you reason with those two and set goals on that, those are the first two things you have to do to make this work.
You mentioned, I want to talk about some of the misconceptions of DEI. You mentioned that it only means African Americans. What are some of the other misconceptions there are when it comes to DEI?
Well, so there's several. That's a very good question. One misconception, for example, is that it's about training. Right, and that backfires because the training we perceive is about changing the way you think about people. That's not. It's about behaviors and managing behaviors within an organization. So that's the first misconception. Another misconception is that it's uniform for everybody. That there is some way of creating a program that works for women and neurodiverse and LGBTQ. You can't do that. You really have to take the time and look at a strategy for each one of them. And it's actually easier than it sounds. If we're doing the proper kind of personal development and coaching, one of the things we did at Allied Signal, right, everybody had their own development plan. And if you're sensitive to the cultural aspects of that person, you're automatically doing it. You don't have to do anything special. You just have to make sure you pay attention to that. Another challenge or another misconception has to do with how we I guess, how we count the numbers, right? Everybody likes to look at what's the percentage of the population that's there, and they want to say that's our target. That's unrealistic.
Right.
That has to go away. And then I think one of the biggest misconceptions that really makes it hard is that we can then assimilate everybody to one culture. This is the question I always talk about: tomato bisque versus gumbo. We don't want to homogenize the culture, because you don't do that now. We recognize we have different people with different backgrounds. We want to create a culture where those differences can exist. So that perception that DEI is about normalizing a culture is a mistake. You really want to make the culture, polydiverse, and how do you manage that?
To talk about your gumbo versus tomato bisque analogy.
Yeah, so when I'm working with organizations, I always, especially when I'm working with the senior management, I start the conversation with when you start to envision what diversity means in your community, is it tomato bisque where everything's homogenized, still tastes good, but it's all homogenized, or is it gumbo where we have these individual pieces and there's a roux that ties all that together? Again, very delicious meal, but a very different representation. And so I do that because it accomplishes a couple of things. One, it depersonalizes the conversation. So now people can talk a little more comfortably, because you got to create that psychological safety for everybody to work with. But the second reason I do that is because it's easier for people to wrestle with concepts when it's not challenging people's beliefs. And so usually what happens is the majority of people go to tomato bisque. They start to think that I need a homogeneous community, and so we want everybody to be treated the same. But then as you get into the conversation, they start to realize, well, no, I really want people's pathway to their current position to be noted. I want the fact that someone had a different experience in an aerospace company versus someone in automotive. So I really don't want homogeneous. All right, if that's the case, then the gumbo is the right solution. Now, what does that mean in terms of how my organization operates?
Sure.
So that's why I use it, and I think it's a good way to get
that
conversation started.
Can you share some examples of businesses in our area, that have successfully implemented DEI strategies, initiatives? That's
that's a challenging question.
Okay.
Mainly because I've got a lot of companies here who are talking to me, and they're all struggling. So, in all honesty, no, I don't have a good example, and I'm not disturbed by that.
Well, why are they struggling? What are those obstacles there?
I think the obstacles are threefold. One is the fear of the publicity of doing it. That comes up a lot, is that it's going to be perceived as something negative, or be perceived that we're just doing it because it's politically the right thing to do. So there's a fear associated with that. The second one is, and this is probably the one that I like to spend attention on, is people don't have the tools and the skill sets to address it. It's interesting, and that's not unique to this area. The more companies I talk to, more I realize they do not have the kind of tools that are necessary to go out and analyze, to understand, and then to come up with solutions. And then the third one, which is really falls into misconception, is that it's too costly to do it, and so they won't do that.
That's always the number one barrier for anything, right?
Right, exactly.
Cost,
But you got to look at it as an investment.
I know, of course.
And not look at it
That's
as just an absolute cost that you'll never recover.
That's right. I mean, how can some of those challenges be overcome?
So I think there's several ways. So one, and this is one of the things I think the chamber can do, I think Marshall University could do, is we got to create a program, whether it's a workshop or whether it's some kind of a group that comes together on a regular basis that teaches those tools. It's really that simple.
Sure.
Yeah. So that's one way to do it. The second one is to treat those companies that are very good at doing strategic planning, use those same elements. So when we want to go into a new market, what do? Well, we go and try to understand the size of the market. And then we try to figure out what percentage of the market do we have right now, what percentage do we want to have, and what are the kind of tools we want to use to grow. You do the same thing. Just start with that conversation on tomato bisque versus gumbo, come up to a nice consensus, pick the one area you want to work on, and then use your strategic planning tools to go and address that area.
What about with smaller businesses? Huntington, the backbone of, I think, of our economy is small businesses, and most economies it is. I mean,
right.
Especially here, we have so many good stories of small businesses. Again, talk about costs and so forth and limited resources, but what are some steps that they can take to promote DEI?
So I would actually say, and I've seen this work in different areas of the country, is that they come together as a collective and work. So let's take, for example, we want to address a women's a single mother's issue, right? That's a big issue in this community. So I looked in, there was a community in New Jersey where they came together and said, you know what? We can't deal with this on our own, but about 5 or 10 different companies came together, small businesses, and said, can we develop a child care contract so that we can create a child care facility where any of the mothers in our organization drop off their children there, and we get a discount because it's our group. You don't have to worry about getting on a waiting list and everything else, and manage it that way. So I think once you pick out what those areas of focus are, you start coming together as a group and solving them collectively.
Sure.
That's small businesses to try to solve this on their own. It will become costly, and that's probably not the best way to do it.
When you mentioned the challenges, is a challenge people are they afraid to have these conversations? Are they afraid of offending somebody if I say Black or African American, or I'm being very serious. I'm afraid to use the wrong pronouns. I'm afraid to use the wrong LGBTQ, whatever. Is that a problem too?
Yeah,
Are people afraid?
I'm grinning because I literally just read a paper last night, a research paper, and the number one recommendation they had is to start having conversations.
Yeah.
So yes, people are afraid, and you're going to screw up. But you build trust and you build openness by having those conversations. So, that was the number one thing. Even if it's going to be uncomfortable, sit down and start having that conversation.
Yeah. It's okay to mess up. It's okay.
Right.
I mean,
it's okay,
yes.
Right. You don't do it where it's going to be radicalized.
Yes.
Right? So,
yes.
But, if you have your employees together, or you have your counterparts in other companies, and you say, look, we want to start having a conversation, and you ask the question, what's the right way to approach it?
Yeah.
It's as silly as it may sound.
No. But everybody is so afraid to offend somebody, right? And I don't want to say the wrong, I don't want to sound stupid, I don't want to sound offensive,
right.
Whatever. Sometimes we're afraid just to talk,
But that there are, and this is something that's starting to emerge. I wish they were more visible. Having kind of culture coaches.
Yeah.
I looked at what Nordstrom, the department store. That's one of the things they did. They're in over 85% women managers, and they noticed that that African American women and Hispanic women were not matriculating to higher levels of management. And so what they did is pulled them together and had the conversation. A little bit challenging at first, but what they ended up learning is that there were certain in-store experiences that were recommendations that came from sponsoring upper managers that they never got exposure to. So they made that a more formal group, and they ended up having culture coaches. And so these are women who are willing to have those conversations, to be in those rooms, to help facilitate it, so people became more comfortable. That's this whole area of psychological safety.
Sure.
How do you create that environment so you can do that?
How can businesses, in Huntington work with government, work with City Hall and their state government and so forth to promote diversity and inclusion? Should those conversations be should they take place with your representatives and such?
Yeah, that I think it depends on the issue.
Okay.
On one hand, for example, I look at there's 27 states right now that have what do they call them? Crown laws.
Okay.
If you haven't heard about those, so those are laws that prevent discrimination based on hairstyle.
Okay.
Now, it's a very strange law, but that came about because, African American women who were wearing their hair more natural, so whether they were wearing dreads or, or just, large afros or whatever, they found out that they were being discriminated against in hiring and promotion. Well, in those cases, they had to have legislative conversations so that laws could be passed, which are now called the Crown laws. They were passed to prevent that kind of discrimination. So in those kind of cases, if you look at labor laws, for example, having those conversations, we're talking about bringing people in to the state.
That's right.
So if they come in and they see this, salary discrimination, making sure legislation is reflecting the protection of salary against diverse groups. So I think they have to be very select and very reasonable. I do think we're living in a world where we're banning books and things of that nature in education. Yeah, you probably still have to have the conversations there as well.
Sure.
But I think they'll be very select.
Let me go back to the Center for Economic and Community Development in Black Appalachia and Isolated Communities. You mentioned like Sean Hornbuckle a minute ago. I know Sean has gone to Seattle, you mentioned as well, and kind of tell with Marshall University and other legislative leaders and kind of telling the story of West Virginia. Are you going to help tell that story to businesses like, hey, this is what we're doing in West Virginia, trying to go against some of those stereotypes that we have in West Virginia, and hey, this is the stuff that we're doing now, and we're working on a DEI programs and so forth. Are you trying? Is that going to be part of our story to corporations?
It could be.
It should be.
It should be. Yeah. Again, we only started in May, so we haven't got to that point yet.
Yeah.
But I know all the players who are doing that and making those visits. I'm sure eventually they'll pull me in as
it should be. I mean, it really should be.
It is a lost opportunity if we don't. If I look at Dr. Cicero Fain, right, and he's working to start the Black Appalachian Cultural Center. The whole purpose of that center is economic development. That's one of the drives, I should say. The idea that you've got the father of African American history, Carter G. Woodson, that's from Huntington.
That's right.
Right, and the idea that no one has ever mapped the Underground Railroad sites here in West Virginia, right? So you start thinking about that. Well, that's a tourism story.
Absolutely.
So, you build that, it's a tourism, that needs to be part of this conversation.
That's right.
We're having outside. So I think we're early in that process, but you're absolutely right. If we don't have it as part of that conversation, we're missing a wonderful opportunity.
I mean, I love history. I didn't know we had Underground Railroad sites in West Virginia. Right. I love that kind of stuff. I've been to in other places, so no, you're right. What about the future? Are there any upcoming trends, innovative approaches to DEI that businesses should be aware of in this area?
Yeah, I think it's going to be about, what are those right essential tools? I like this idea of Charles Moran and his, new economic analysis tools like he used in Nashville, but applying those to communities of color or just communities of difference.
That's right.
Right? I love that idea. So, I think you're going to see that come along. I think the tools that are necessary, in the future, I'm partnering with the College of Business in a lot of what I do. So, for example, just research on how do you use new market tax credits to build a community. The research on that for small communities is very limited. We know how to do it for a $50 million investment we're bringing in a new Target and a new department store. We don't know how to do new market tax credits in a consistent way for small communities.
That's right.
And that should be in partnership with small businesses. So I think the future to me looks like that. Where are the new tools? How do we use them? How do we structure them so we can create new systems that the rest of the country grows and learns from us?
This has been In Your Business. I'm your host, Reeves Kurtner. Thanks again to Dr. Alan Letton for joining us. Thank you for listening. If you enjoy this podcast, please like, subscribe, share, and even leave us a review. Season 1 of In Your Business is presented by Moses Auto Mall of Huntington, MosesMeansMore.com, and powered by the Huntington Regional Chamber of Commerce and Kindred Communications.